and start that. All right. Thank you all so much. Again, this is Science Diplomacy 101. This is an event for those who are trying to figure out what science diplomacy even really means. So to kick us off, we're going to have a little bit of an icebreaker. I would like to hear from you what you think of when you hear science diplomacy. So if you have your phones open, if you have your computer open, which somehow you do because you're watching us right now, I would really like you to go to this Mentimeter website, put in that code, and then give just a quick sentence, a couple of buzzwords or keywords. What does science diplomacy mean to you? We're going to take about 3 to 5 minutes to do that, and then we'll jump right in. I'm seeing some key issues that we know span global, kind of the global sphere and country borders, like climate change, the Arctic. I'm seeing some themes of dialogue between diplomats, international specialists, and scientists. And I'm also seeing some key skills coming out, like communication, using evidence, cultural competency. These are really, really great answers. I'm going to go ahead and start winding us down in here and turn the screen back over to Leanna, but feel free to keep, if you have some more answers you'd like to add, go ahead and do that. But in the meantime, Leanna, I'm going to turn the screen back over to you. Okay, so you all had just kind of gave us an answers to what you think science diplomacy means. And I want to say that this is a conversation that we have a lot of times in NSPN. In fact, we have an entire committee that's dedicated to this, and that's the Science Diplomacy Committee. So this is a space where we join together to really put our heads together to figure out what does science diplomacy mean to us and where do we fit in, both as scientists as a whole and individuals. So before we kind of get into the nitty gritty of the material, I really want to talk a little bit about what this community is, because this is a resource that's available to you and we would sincerely love to welcome you into. We have monthly meetings where we check in with one another about the various things our committee is doing. And it's really a space where we can build a community and get to know one another. So along those lines, we do projects. So we launch different events. We learn together through different seminars that we help organize. I have a little graphic right here from one of our past seminars where we got to speak with an expert about ocean diplomacy. We have different networking opportunities where we meet with other science organizations across the world. We've met with graduate student organizations and science organizations in Europe and other states. We've had a really great opportunity to meet other people that are also interested in this topic. We've had book clubs in order to kind of dive into some really cool moments in science diplomacy history and topics. And we formed teams within ourselves in order to really build our resumes and submit and have articles published that talk about the various needs within science diplomacy. So again, I just want to emphasize that this is a space that we would love to have you in and that is available to NSPN members. Right, Andy, you just kind of go to the next one. So what really is science diplomacy? Well, you've probably heard of science policy. And so when we think of science policy, we're really thinking about a key buzzword, and that's domestic. So this is something that's really encapsulated within a country's borders, whether it's the United States or another country. When we think of diplomacy, we're really expanding those horizons, either be between two different countries, multiple different countries, and we're really expanding that scale. So really all we're thinking about the difference between science policy and diplomacy is kind of what is our foot view almost, like how far out are we going? So I do want to emphasize that there is kind of some similarities between science policy and diplomacy, but because diplomacy has such a larger scope, that means it can be a little hard to really understand, like, but what really is it though in practice? And so that's kind of what we'd like to explore a little bit with you, both within this presentation and then a little bit later in some breakout rooms too. So that's kind of the end of my little spiel. I'm now going to turn it over to Leanna to go into some of these topics with a little bit more depth.
Thanks so much, Lindsay, and thanks so much everyone for being here. Super excited to see everyone's interest in science diplomacy. So when you're here, you're probably wondering, well, how do you define science diplomacy? And really, that's a very difficult question to answer because there's really no universal definition for what science diplomacy is. Countries and professionals, they understand this concept in many different ways. Science diplomacy has become multidimensional, multi-layered, very complex, and has multiple meanings depending on who you're talking to. Activities that can fall under this umbrella are often not labeled as such. For example, some alternative types of diplomacy can have different labels applied, such as water diplomacy, health diplomacy, or even cyber diplomacy. But all the different definitions or understanding to a certain extent recognize the need for science diplomacy due to the increasing importance of the intersection of science and diplomacy. For example, we want to recognize the increasing interconnectedness of different countries, such as through globalization, science and technology, or even just the digital world that we find ourselves in right now. Also, there are many different problems that can only be solved in cooperation between different countries, such as climate change, pandemics, as we've been living through, refugee crises, monitoring nuclear technology, governing high seas, space, and cyberspace. So with that all being said, while there is no universal definition for science diplomacy, we are going to introduce you to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS's definition of science diplomacy. And they tend to separate this into 3 distinct categories that really aren't so distinct. So this is science in diplomacy, diplomacy for science, and science for diplomacy. So starting with science in diplomacy, this umbrella topic really just describes when you are informing foreign policy objectives with scientific advice. A really good example of this is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. And really, this panel was formed to advance knowledge on human-induced climate change. We also have diplomacy for science, which the goal of this is to facilitate international science cooperation. And this is really just defined as joint research programs and flagship international projects. This can be pursued either top down or bottom up. For example, we have the Large Hadron Collider by the European Organization for Nuclear Research. And really, they just work together to study particle physics. We have Genome Asia 100K Consortium, and this is a collaboration by different universities to raise representation of Asian genomes in biomedical research by sequencing 100,000 genomes of people living in Asia. And then finally, we have science for diplomacy. So this is when we're using science cooperation to improve international relations between countries. A pretty good example of this is back in 1975, we had the Apollo-Soyuz test project, and this was a space exploration that was led by the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and this was one of the first peaceful initiatives during the Cold War. So while, like I said, this is packaged into 3 nice little definitions, of course, as we've been saying, it's not packaged that nicely in the real world, and the jobs that people can hold within this space can span across these different areas. So what I'm going to do next is we're going to go through 4 people within NSPN's network as well as elsewhere are doing work within science diplomacy. And this is just to highlight the different things that can be done with different backgrounds of scientific knowledge. So we're going to start with Patricia Gruver. So Patricia's educational background, she has a Bachelor of Science in Biology as well as a master's degree in epidemiology. And she has just done a ton of diplomacy work, starting with the British consulate in both General Los Angeles and the General Boston offices for several years, working as a research, innovation, and trade attaché. And currently she's working as a tech diplomacy fellow for the Pacific Council on International Policy. I know Patricia pretty well, actually. So she's actually NSPN staff, and she's working with the SciDeal project, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But she also really cares a lot about training the next generation of science diplomats and teaching people the importance of this field. Our next person that we want to feature, I'm sorry, I can't speak French, so I'm going to try my best to pronounce his name properly. Jean-Christophe Maudouet. I strongly apologize pronouncing that so incorrectly. But Jean-Christophe has a master's in law and diplomacy, a master's and a PhD in astronomy and astrophysics. So our physicists in the room, this is your guy to look for. A ton of interesting experience working as a project officer for the International Astronomical Union, working for a AAAS in the Center for Science Diplomacy, working as an associate director for the Science Diplomacy Center at Tufts University, as well as doing just tons of lectures in science diplomacy. So this is another person who has taken their scientific knowledge, coupled it with international experiences, and is now working to train the next generation of science diplomats. Moving on to Scott Wicker. So Scott's educational background, he has a master's degree in chemistry, a PhD in environmental toxicology, and has spent a lot of time working both in and out of academia. So Scott actually sent us a little blurb about himself that I'll read out. So he currently serves as an environmental toxicologist for the Mekong US Partnership and Friends of the Mekong Initiatives. This partnership and like-minded friends initiatives are multinational efforts intended to create and support integrated sub-regional cooperation between Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, and the United States. These initiatives' mission is to address transboundary challenges and strengthen transparent good governance by upholding rules-based system that underpins regional prosperity and stability. As a senior science advisor, Dr. Wicker monitors, analyzes, and provides policy recommendations on environmental issues that impact the Mekong River Basin and its tributaries. He also collaborates with interagency stakeholders on the use of essential water data and satellite technology for programmatic assessments and policymaking to promote data democratization, sustainable water, natural resource management, and environmental protection in the Southeast Asia region. And he does this alongside being an associate professor of chemistry. So if you're looking for a career in science diplomacy, but you don't want to leave academia, Dr. Wicker is an amazing example of something that you can accomplish while working in this field. And then last but not least, we have Benjamin Schmidt. Benjamin has a bachelor's in mathematics, as well as in physics and astronomy. And he went on to get his master's and PhD in physics and astronomy as well. So he previously worked as a European energy security advisor at the US Department of State. And his job here was to advance diplomatic engagement vital to the energy and national security interests of the transatlantic community, with a focus on supporting the resilience of NATO's eastern flank. He also provides expert transatlantic security policy commentary for both print and television media, and you can see the many places that he's written for on the screen there. And currently he's working as a postdoctoral research fellow and project development specialist at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. And this is where he's responsible for developing instrumentation and infrastructure for next generation Antarctic experimental cosmology facilities at the South Pole. So really interesting work that he's doing there. I'll turn it back to you, Lindsay.
Thank you so very much. Okay, so what we've just kind of done is shown you what are the concrete definitions of science diplomacy? How is it defined on paper? How do we as a community tend to define that as we kind of converse and meet with scientists that are still really exploring what science diplomacy means? And then lastly, we've also seen a couple of case examples of people who are officially in that role. What I want to also just re-emphasize before we go into breakout rooms is that one of the things that's very exciting, but also understandably sometimes confusing about science diplomacy is that there is no one road that makes you a science diplomat. Leanna has shown several examples of people that have worked in academia, that are working in government, that are still postdocs, that are full in their careers. There's no one subject matter that makes you a science diplomat. You can either have a formal background in international studies. Maybe you also just have more experiential life, kind of travel, family ties that make you really understanding of a certain area of the world. So what we really want to emphasize is that this is a space that is welcome of kind of really all backgrounds. This is a space that we within this community have the expertise to stand into with confidence and hopefully more together. So within that spirit, what we wanted to do is to really give you the opportunity to think deeply about some of these questions and also interact with those who are interested in science diplomacy. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into some breakout rooms. You were welcome to discuss whatever aspect of this presentation was most interesting to you. But I also have about 5 questions here that if you're able, I'd like you to try to focus on. And aside to, of course, the intros and getting to know who on earth you were also talking with. So we're going to do this for probably about half an hour or so before I bring you back and we kind of close out our time together. But the last thing that I kind of want to emphasize again is that since this is going to be the last part of the recording, that really our Science Diplomacy Committee is a space where you're welcome to learn more about science diplomacy. You're welcome to ask questions, including the ones that are right here on the screen with people who are also trying to figure this out or maybe have even some of the answers for this. So just a quick plug for the recording's sake. If you have questions about this or would like to learn more, send an email to diplomacy@scipolnetwork.org. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording